forest is on fire. Not metaphorically. The trees around them are splintering into shards of wet wood and burning bark, and the sound is not the sound of war as most people imagine it. It is not the distant thunder of cinema. It is a pressure wave that hits you in the sternum, like a closed fist, that fills your ears with a ringing that replaces all other thought, that turns the ground beneath your feet into something alive and hostile and unpredictable. Major Charles Whittlesey is crouching behind a rock ledge in the Argonne Forest, and the shells that are killing his men are American shells. That is the unbearable part. That is the part that makes the whole thing something beyond ordinary tragedy. His men are not dying because of the enemy tonight. They are dying because someone at a headquarters somewhere has drawn the wrong coordinates on a map. They are dying because of a clerical error. They are dying because the machine of war has lost track of the very soldiers it was trying to protect. And now the machine is devouring them with the same mechanical indifference it devours everything else. Whittlesey has already sent 2 pigeons. Both were shot down before they could clear the tree line. He knows this because his men watched it happen. He knows this because there were cries of despair from the trenches when the second bird fell. Because these men, these exhausted, starving, wounded men, had placed something like faith in a bird. And now there is 1 pigeon left, 1 bird, 1 chance. He reaches into the wooden cage with hands that are not entirely steady, and he pulls out a small creature that weighs less than a pound, that has dark checkered feathers and orange eyes that do not register fear the way human eyes do, that looks back at him with an expression that could be called, if you were feeling generous, serene. He rolls the message around the tiny canister. He attaches it to the bird's leg. He has 40 kilometers between this cage and the divisional loft. He has German machine gun nests in every direction. He has his men watching him. He opens his hands, and Cher Ami takes flight into the worst sky in the world. That is where this story begins. Not at the beginning, but at the moment everything is already lost, because that is the only honest place to start a story like this one. But to understand why that bird mattered, why the fate of nearly 200 men was attached to a creature that weighed less than a loaf of bread, you have to go back further. You have to go back to England, to the lofts where pigeons were bred for distance and speed, and that mysterious internal compass that scientists still do not fully understand. You have to go back to the decision made by men in suits rather than uniforms that the most reliable communication technology in a world being torn apart by industrial warfare was not the telegraph, not the radio, not the telephone, but a bird that remembered where home was and would fly there no matter what. The United States Army Signal Corps had been using carrier pigeons on the Western Front since the Americans entered the war in 1917. By the autumn of 1918, they had approximately 600 birds deployed across the various sectors of the front. Each one was trained, fed, cataloged, given a number and a record and a handler who knew its particular temperament. Some birds were fast, some were reliable in bad weather, some panicked under shell fire and had to be removed from service. The Corps treated its pigeons with a level of practical seriousness that might seem absurd until you understand the alternative, which was silence. The front was too large, too chaotic, too saturated with electromagnetic interference and exploded copper wire for conventional communication to be trusted. Runners could be killed. Telephone lines could be cut. Radio signals could be intercepted. But a pigeon, once released, followed a drive so deep in its biology that no amount of noise or fire or chaos had ever entirely suppressed it. It flew home. That was what it did. That was what it had been doing for thousands of years of human civilization, carrying messages between cities, between armies, between lovers, separated by distance and circumstance. The bird did not understand the message. It did not understand the war. It understood only the pull of the loft it had been raised in, the magnetic and olfactory and visual memory that pointed it always in one direction: home. Cher Ami was not a remarkable pigeon by any external measure. And here we should pause and acknowledge the historical confusion, because the bird was identified as male throughout the war and was only revealed to be female during a post-mortem examination years later, was a black check hen, one of several hundred birds donated to the American war effort by British pigeon fanciers. She had been trained, as all Signal Corps pigeons were trained, through repetition and conditioning, released from progressively greater distances until the homing instinct was as reliable as any piece of machinery the Army possessed. She had completed missions before. She had flown distances that would be impressive for any bird, and had done so under conditions that would have grounded most aircraft. But she was not famous. She had no reputation. She was a working animal in a working army, one small gear in a machine of almost incomprehensible scale. And she had no way of knowing, on the morning of October 4th, 1918, that the day would make her the most celebrated bird in American military history. To understand what she was flying toward, you need to understand what had happened to the men she was flying for. The Meuse-Argonne offensive had begun on September 26, 1918, and it was the largest military operation in American history. Over 1 million men, a front stretching for nearly 40 miles, a push through some of the most fortified terrain in France. The Argonne Forest was a particular nightmare. The trees provided cover for German defensive positions that had been prepared over years of occupation. The terrain was broken by ravines and ridges that made coordinated movement almost impossible. The Americans were fighting with enormous courage and almost no tactical experience, and they were paying for that inexperience in the currency the war always demanded, which was young men's lives. The 77th Division, the division to which Whittlesey's battalion belonged, was a unit drawn largely from New York City. They called themselves the Metropolitan Division, and they had come from the streets of Manhattan and Brooklyn and the Bronx, from immigrant families who had everything to prove and nothing to apologize for. And they had been thrown into one of the most complex and brutal sectors of the entire offensive. On October 2nd, following orders that assumed a general advance along the entire line, Major Charles Whittlesey led approximately 550 men forward through the forest. The advance worked, up to a point. His men pushed deep into German-held territory, finding gaps in the enemy line and exploiting them with the kind of aggressive momentum that good commanders build in good troops. And then, sometime in the late afternoon, Whittlesey realized that the units on his flanks had not kept pace. The French division to his left and the American units to his right had been stopped, held up by resistance that Whittlesey's orders had not accounted for. His battalion was alone, several kilometers behind enemy lines, in a shallow depression in the forest that offered some protection but no escape. They dug in. They sent runners back. The runners did not return. They tried the telephone. The wire had been cut. They sent more runners. German patrols began to close the gaps through which they had advanced. By nightfall on October 2nd, the Lost Battalion was a reality rather than a nickname. For 2 days, Whittlesey's men held their position. They had rations for 1 day, which they stretched to 3 by eating almost nothing. They had ammunition, but using it revealed their position, and every engagement brought more German troops to the perimeter. They had wounded men who could not be evacuated, and who died in the mud in slow, agonizing increments, calling for water and morphine and their mothers, as dying men in every war have always done. They had no way to call for air supply, because the technology did not yet exist in reliable form. They had pigeons, 3 of them. On October 3rd, Whittlesey sent the first 2 birds. The first, named Zip, carried a message requesting artillery support to the north and east. The message arrived. The artillery fired. But the coordinates were slightly wrong, and the shells fell on Whittlesey's own position, killing and wounding more of his already depleted force. The second bird, whose name history has not preserved, was dispatched to report the situation and request correction. It was shot down by German fire before it cleared the trees. No message arrived. And then there was one. If you want to understand Charles Whittlesey, understand this. He was a lawyer before he was a soldier. He had graduated from Williams College and then from Harvard Law School. And he had built a practice in New York City. And he had a life that was organized around argument and evidence, and the careful, measured application of reason to conflict. He was not a romantic. He was not a man who thought in symbols or metaphors. He was a man who thought in facts and outcomes. And on the morning of October the 4th, 1918, the fact was that his artillery was killing his men, and the outcome he required was a cessation of that fire. And the only means available to achieve that outcome was a bird that weighed less than a pound and had already watched 2 of her companions shot out of the sky. He wrote the message with the controlled precision of a man who understood that every word had to carry its weight. We are along the road parallel 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it. He did not write please. He did not write urgent. He wrote, for heaven's sake, which is as close as a Harvard-trained lawyer in 1918 comes to screaming. He attached the message to Cher Ami's leg, opened the cage, and let his last hope take flight. She fell. That is the first thing that happened. The German machine gunners who had been watching the American position had learned over the past 48 hours that the Americans were using pigeons, and they had been specifically watching for the release of a bird. The moment Cher Ami left Whittlesey's hands, the guns opened up on her. She was knocked from the air within meters of the cage. She hit the ground and lay still. And the men who were watching, the men who had been through 2 days of starvation and shelling and the deaths of friends, and the slow, grinding understanding that they had been forgotten, those men thought it was over. There are accounts from survivors who described the moment as the worst of the entire ordeal. Not the shells, not the hunger, not even the deaths. The moment the bird went down, because the bird was the last thing. If a person has been through everything and still has one last hope, and that hope weighs 12 ounces and has orange eyes and is lying in the mud 20 meters away, then the silence that follows its fall is a very particular kind of silence. It is the silence of people who have stopped believing that the future contains anything good. And then Cher Ami moved, She shook herself. She stood. In accounts from survivors, some men report that she seemed to orient herself, that she turned, looked in a direction, and began to run, which is not a word one associates with birds, but which is the word these men used, because she moved across the ground with a purposefulness that read as intention rather than panic. She opened her wings. She caught an updraft. She rose. She rose above the tree line into the full, open, terrible sky of the Argonne, where the German guns were waiting, and where the air was thick with lead and fire, and the 1,000 random vectors of a battlefield in its full fury. And she flew north. She flew the way a compass needle points north, not because she chose to, not because she was brave in any way that involves decision-making, but because she was built to fly home, and home was north, and nothing in the physical world had yet managed to stop her. This is the part of the story that resists clean explanation, because what she did next was not something any animal is expected to survive. The German gunners tracked her. They kept firing. They were very good at their jobs, which is why this was a war that had killed millions of people. A rifle bullet, moving at nearly 900 meters per second, hit her. The accounts differ slightly on the sequence of her wounds, but what the post-mortem examination established was that she was shot through the chest, that she lost her right eye somewhere during the flight, and that the leg carrying the message was very nearly severed, hanging by a single tendon, the way a door hangs when its hinge is broken. She was hit multiple times. She kept flying. 25 minutes. That is how long it took. 40 kilometers, a shattered chest, a missing eye, a leg that existed only technically by the time she arrived, and she covered the distance in 25 minutes at an average speed of roughly 96 kilometers per hour. She arrived at the divisional loft at Rampont, covered in blood, barely able to land. The soldiers and handlers who received her said she looked like she had flown through the actual center of the battle rather than over it, which in a meaningful sense she had. The message canister was still attached to the tendon that had been her leg. The paper inside was still readable. The words were still there. A signals officer read the message. The information was relayed to the artillery batteries. The guns that had been methodically killing Whittlesey's men stopped firing. The silence that fell over Charlevoix Ravine was the silence of a crisis receding rather than a hope dying, and it arrived directly and entirely because a bird with a destroyed body had refused to stop flying. Let us stay in that silence for a moment, because this is the part of the story where the full weight of what happened becomes apparent. 194 men survived the Lost Battalion. That is the number that historians attach to Cher Ami's mission, the number of men who were still alive when rescue finally reached them on October 8th, and who would not have been alive if the artillery had continued firing, and who would not have been alive if the message had not arrived, and who would not have been alive if a 12-ounce bird had accepted the option of not flying. 194 men. When you try to hold that number against the weight of the bird, something happens to your understanding of proportion. History is made by large forces, armies, economies, political systems, industrial machines. And then sometimes it tilts on something absurdly small, a bird, a message on a piece of paper, a tendon that did not quite break. Now, perhaps you are the kind of person who resists the sentimental reading of this story. Perhaps you are the kind of person who wants to locate the causality correctly, who wants to say that the bird did not make a decision, that there was no courage involved in the biological sense, that the homing instinct is not the same thing as bravery, that we are committing a category error when we assign human virtues to animal behavior. And you are, in the strict scientific sense, probably right. Cher Ami did not understand the message she was carrying. She did not understand that men would live or die based on whether she completed her mission. She understood only the pull of home, the deep, unglamorous biological truth of a creature returning to the place where it was fed and sheltered and known. That is all she was doing. She was going home. But here is the thing about that. So was every man in that forest. That is what every soldier in every war is doing, in the end. They are trying to go home. They are trying to get back to the place where they are fed and sheltered and known. And the entire apparatus of war is the thing standing between them and that return. And so when Cher Ami fought through the thing standing between her and home, she was doing, in the most literal and biological sense, what all those men were hoping to do. She was just better at it. And that is why, if you want to call it courage, the word does not feel wrong. It feels like the least we can offer. The story of Cher Ami does not exist in isolation. It exists within the larger context of the Meuse Argonne offensive, which was itself the largest military operation in American history, and which unfolded across 40 miles of French countryside from late September to early November of 1918, and which cost the United States approximately 26,000 dead and 95,000 wounded in 47 days of fighting. The numbers are so large they become abstract, which is one of the particular cruelties of industrial warfare. It is too big to be tragic in the individual sense, too big for grief to find its proper footing. The Lost Battalion is one of the places in that enormous abstract disaster where the human scale reasserts itself. 550 men, a forest, a message, a bird. The human scale is survivable, emotionally. The human scale is the scale at which we actually feel things, at which the meaning of something like courage becomes real rather than statistical. And so the story of Cher Ami is, among other things, the story of a war making itself small enough to be understood, for just a moment, by the people trying to understand it. Charles Whittlesey survived the Lost Battalion, though he did not, in any meaningful sense, survive the war. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, the French Croix de Guerre, and several other decorations. He returned to his law practice in New York City. He gave speeches at veterans' events. He attended the funerals of men who had died in the forest under his command. He was, by all accounts, a man in whom something had broken during those 4 days in the Argonne, and who could not find a way to put it back together. On November 26, 1921, 3 years after the armistice, he boarded a ship called the Toloa, sailing from New York to Havana, and sometime in the night he went over the side, and his body was never found. He was 41 years old. The official determination was suicide. Among the theories about why, and there are several because Whittlesey was a private man who left no final note, one that recurs in the historical literature, is that he could not reconcile the fact of his survival with the fact of so many deaths, could not sit with the weight of being the man who came home when so many others had not. He went into the water on the anniversary of the armistice, in the dark, in the Atlantic, and whatever peace he was looking for, it was not available in the world he had come back to. If you want to understand the Lost Battalion, understand that. The survivors of terrible things carry the weight of having survived them. And sometimes the weight is too much, and the most decorated man in the room is also the most broken one. If you have ever known a veteran, a survivor, anyone who came through something that others did not, you know exactly what this means. Leave a comment below if this part of the story means something to you. This is the part that most documentaries skip because it doesn't end cleanly. But the clean ending is not the honest one. Cher Ami was treated by American Army veterinarians at the front. The medical care available to a wounded pigeon in the Argonne Forest in October 1918 was not sophisticated, but it was given with genuine intention by people who understood what the bird had done. They cleaned her wounds. They carved a small wooden prosthetic leg, which she wore for the rest of her life. They nursed her through what should, by any physiological logic, have been a fatal set of injuries. And she lived. General John Blackjack Pershing, the commanding general of the American Expeditionary Forces, the man who oversaw the entire American effort in the First World War, and who was not a sentimental person in any ordinary sense, asked to meet Cher Ami before she was transported back to the United States. He shook the hand of the handler. He looked at the bird. He said, according to accounts from people who were present, that she was one of the most remarkable soldiers he had ever had the privilege of knowing. He used the word soldiers. He was a man who chose his words with military precision, and he chose that one deliberately. Cher Ami arrived in the United States in 1919 and was given to the care of the Signal Corps in Washington. She died on June 13th, 1919, her wounds having taken their delayed toll. She had lived 8 months after the flight, long enough to be celebrated, long enough to be seen, long enough for the people who had kept her alive to understand what they were preserving. She was mounted by a taxidermist and placed in the collection of the Smithsonian Institution, where she remains today, one of the oldest specimens in the museum's military collection. A 12-ounce bird in a glass case, looking out at the visitors with whatever it is that taxidermied eyes look out with, carrying on her body the evidence of everything she flew through. The Croix de Guerre with palm, France's highest military decoration, was pinned to her mount. The French government gave this honor to an American bird, which is a fact that tells you something about the way extraordinary deeds cross the national lines that ordinary life observes. The medal is still there, in the case at the Smithsonian, alongside the wooden leg. If you want to see them, you can. They are on display. This is the kind of thing that matters, that physical evidence matters, because it resists the drift toward abstraction that history always threatens to become. The medal is a real medal. The leg is real wood. The bird is a real bird, or was, and the record of what she did is as well documented as anything in the history of the First World War, which was a war that was documented with obsessive thoroughness by every party involved, because they all knew they were living through something that future generations would need to understand. There is a question that sits underneath this story that is worth asking directly, which is, what does it mean to honor an animal for doing something it could not choose to do? The pigeon community in Britain had donated hundreds of birds to the American war effort, and those birds had not been consulted on the arrangement. They had been bred and trained and deployed in a war that was, from their perspective, simply a more violent and dangerous version of the competitive flights they had been conditioned for. Cher Ami did not make a sacrifice in the way a human makes a sacrifice, which involves understanding what is being given up. She did not decide to keep flying through the German fire. She was keeping flying because stopping was not a behavior she had been built for, because the pull toward home was stronger than the damage being done to her body, because she was, in some fundamental sense, incapable of the kind of calculation that would have allowed her to turn back. Does that make the honor meaningless? Does the absence of choice remove the significance of the act? These are questions without clean answers, and they have been debated by military historians and animal ethicists and ordinary people who just found out about Cher Ami and cannot quite let the story go. The tentative answer that most people land on after sitting with it is no. The honor is not meaningless. The significance is not removed. Because what we honor when we honor Cher Ami is not the decision to be brave. It is the fact that the body kept going when everything suggested it should stop. And that is something. That is, in some configurations, everything. The military use of carrier pigeons did not end with World War I. The Second World War saw even broader deployment of the animals, and the British alone used over 250,000 birds during that conflict. A pigeon named G. Joe delivered a message that stopped an Allied bombing run on an Italian village, saving the lives of over 1,000 people, in a story that mirrors Cher Ami's in its fundamental structure. Small creature, terrible sky, lives in the balance, message delivered. A pigeon named William of Orange flew nearly 300 miles in just over 4 hours to deliver a report from the failed market garden operation in the Netherlands. The pattern repeats itself across the history of 20th century warfare. Machines fail, communications break down, and a bird with an unbreakable instinct toward home becomes the last thread between disaster and survival. There is something about that pattern that deserves more than passing acknowledgement. It speaks to the limits of technology, to the hubris of assuming that human invention can always outperform natural design, to the recurring discovery that the oldest solutions are sometimes the most durable ones. The Argonne Forest today is quiet. The shell craters have been smoothed by a century of seasons, and the trees have grown back, and the farms and villages have returned, and you can walk through the place where the Lost Battalion held its position without immediately registering what happened there. There are markers, there are plaques, there are small memorials that a person could pass without noticing. The place has absorbed the history the way places absorb history, not by erasing it, but by growing over it, by laying new time on top of old time, until the old time becomes a layer rather than the surface. But if you stop and stand in the ravine near the place called Charlevoix Mill, and if you are willing to let your imagination reconstruct it, the noise, the cold October mud, the men dug into their shallow foxholes, the pigeons in their wooden cage at the edge of the command position, then you can feel, faintly, the weight of what those 4 days contained. You can feel the specific quality of hope that attaches to a very small thing when everything large has failed. You can feel what it means to open your hands and let the last thing go. And then, if you are lucky, you can feel what it meant when it flew anyway. There are things in history that we preserve because they tell us what we did. Battles, treaties, laws, the statistics of advancement and regression. And then there are things that we preserve because they tell us what we are, what the species is capable of in all its configurations, including the configurations that do not involve our own species at all. Cher Ami is in the second category. The wooden leg in the Smithsonian case is in the second category. The message on the piece of paper, those words, "For heaven's sake, stop it," those are in the second category too. They tell us something about extremity, about the moments when human composure finally breaks and what is underneath it, and whether what is underneath it is worth preserving. Major Whittlesey was a composed man right up until the moment he was not, and the moment he was not, he wrote those words. And those words are in a glass case in Washington, D.C. And that seems right. It seems right that the breaking point of a composed man's composure should be preserved alongside the bird that made the breaking point survivable. This story does not have a lesson in the conventional sense. It does not resolve into a principle you can carry forward into the organizational management meeting or the motivational speech or the productivity framework. What it has is a question, and the question is this: what is the last thing you are holding on to? And what would it mean to open your hands? Not in a metaphorical, self-help sense, but in the literal sense. What is the thing that stands between where you are and where your people need you to be? What is the distance between you and home? And is there something in you, not courage in the decided, decorated sense, but the more fundamental thing, the older thing, the biological imperative to return? Is there something in you that will keep going even when the sky is full of fire? Cher Ami did not answer that question. She was a bird. She just flew. But in flying, she posed the question to everyone who has heard her story since and will hear it long after the Smithsonian and the Argonne and the language we are using right now have all become history themselves. 194 men walked out of the Argonne Forest because a bird did not stop. If that number means something to you, if you feel, reading it, the specific weight of lives that almost ended and did not, then you understand why this story has been told and retold for over a century, and why it will be told again, and why the wooden leg in the glass case in Washington is not a curiosity, but a fact about what is possible. If you want to understand the First World War, you read the battles and the treaties and the casualty counts. If you want to understand why any of it mattered, you read about a 12-ounce bird flying north through the worst sky in France with a message that said, in the words of a composed man who had stopped being composed, "For heaven's sake, stop." She got through. That is the whole story. That is enough. If the story moved you, if it reminded you of someone who kept going when they had every reason to stop, or of a moment in your own life when the last thing was the only thing, share it in the comments below. These stories survive because people refuse to let them be forgotten, and the comment section of a video like this one is, in its own strange modern way, another kind of message canister, another small container carrying something that needs to arrive. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. The archive of what human beings and the animals who served alongside them have done in the extremes of history is larger than any single channel, and we are only just beginning to open it.